Well, joining me now is Dr. Mike Tildesley, Professor in Infectious Disease Modelling at the University of Warwick. For more on this, Professor, thank you very much for your time this morning. To what extent is there growing evidence that people can be infectious for quite a long period of time with coronavirus, perhaps longer than initially thought?
Well, certainly, we are starting to see, increased evidence of this being the case, that we know, as has already been said by your previous interviewee, that people can be infectious with the virus, maybe about 1 to 3 days, actually, before symptoms start to emerge. This new policy of going up to 10 days isn't necessarily going to do much to mitigate that problem, but perhaps more seriously, there is evidence that possibly people are most infectious within that period of 7 days, around when they start to show symptoms, but people may be infectious even for a few days after they start showing symptoms. And so this 10-day period from the point that you start to show symptoms will hopefully capture some of those people, particularly people who have slightly stronger symptoms. It will capture those people and potentially reduce their risk of passing on further infection.
It sounds as though you think 7 days was the bare minimum that this isolation period should be, and perhaps not enough.
I think the problem is, and if you're talking to me and my advice as an infectious disease expert, then if the only thing you're considering is minimising the risk to public health, then of course you have as long an isolation period as possible, because that would be the thing that would minimise the risk of transmission of disease. Now, I accept, of course, that there are practical considerations that have to be made when a time limit is put in place as to which someone needs to isolate. I would say 7 days is, yes, slightly on the low side, and as has already been discussed, there are other countries that already are using this 10-day window, and of course that's the WHO recommendation. So I think 10 days provides a reasonable balance, whereby we should hopefully within that period capture the vast majority of people, so that by the time they are released from isolation, they are no longer infectious.
Now, I'm not going to ask you a political question about whether the UK should have done this sooner, but given where we are at with the virus now in the UK and cases of the virus, does introducing 10 days at this point, is that going to be effective in hopefully stopping more spikes? And we already have had a few spikes, haven't we, in various parts of England?
Well, we're at a very delicate phase of the epidemic. And of course, it's been widely reported over the last few days that there is a severe risk of a large second wave occurring. And of course, we're seeing evidence of that in Spain and rising cases in France and in Germany and in Belgium. And the danger is that obviously in the UK, cases have plateaued, and there is a suggestion that there is evidence in the data that they may be slightly starting to rise in some areas. So if we want to prevent a large second wave occurring, then of course testing and tracing is going to play a role. Local measures to try to contain the spread of disease if we have outbreaks will play a role. And this increase to 10 days will play a role, because what we don't want, of course, is to have to go into a large-scale lockdown again that we saw come into place back in March.
So whether we call it a second wave or one big wave or localized spikes, you're a person who sees how diseases spread and travel, how they move through a population. What would your message be to everyone watching this, who might be feeling, oh, we've been okay so far, it's the summer, let's relax a little bit, we're coming back from somewhere where there have been more cases, to the UK, but, we don't need to quarantine, for example. For anyone who is feeling in the slightest bit relaxed or even complacent about this, what is your message?
Well, I think the key thing is that, when we went into lockdown back in March, I think many of the scientific community were amazed by the overwhelming sort of way that the public embraced, adhered to lockdown. And I think this was something that we were all extremely surprised about, that people were able to sustain that for a very long period of time. And that's the reason that we were able to suppress the first wave in the way that we did. And I think the key message really is we're not out of the woods yet. We don't want to have to go into national lockdown again. The way that we do that is to keep adhering to those measures. If local controls are put in place, we abide by those. If someone is developing symptoms, they rapidly get tested and allow for their contacts to be traced. We need to follow these rules so that we don't go into a larger scale lockdown later in the year.